Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, and welcome. My name is Monica Ricci, and I'm the Director of Marketing for CATSI, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar as part of our Tech and Cyber Trends Bright Talk channel. And happy October to you all. Happy National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We're excited to have a great and interesting topic today, getting inside insider threats, response and mitigation, presented by Nisos. Nisos is a provider of offensive and defensive cyber investigation services to America's best known companies to help protect their IP, their data, and reputations from sophisticated threat actors. And before we get started today, a couple of administrative issues for those of you in the audience. You can hear us, hopefully, but unfortunately we cannot hear you, and that's just the way that the Bright Talk platform works. However, we are really interested in interacting with you. We want to answer any questions that may come to mind as we go through the content today. So I want to encourage you, as a question comes to mind, please use the questions box in the Bright Talk dashboard. And we've reserved some time at the end of today's session to answer as many questions as we can during the time we have allotted. So again, repeating the subject for today, looking forward to getting into it, getting inside insider threats, response, and mitigation. And I want to introduce our speakers today. From Nisos, we have Ryan Lai, and Ryan is the Executive Vice President of Professional Services at Nisos. Good morning, Ryan. How are you today?
Doing great, Monica. Thanks. How are you?
Great. I'm doing great. Well, I'm happy that you're here. Ryan has 13 years experience in the information security industry, and his focus area has been research against advanced and non-traditional threats, many of which manifest as malicious insider activity. We also, joining Ryan today, we have Paul Morissette, who's a security engineer at Nisos. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Good morning, Monica.
Welcome. And Paul has over 20 years experience in information security, digital forensics, and investigations. So I think without further ado, I would like to turn over the microphone, as it were, to Ryan to get started. So Ryan, over to you.
Great, thanks. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We're here to talk about insider threats, specifically regarding the steps you can take proactively to prevent any type of potential insider activity from having a major impact, along with what you can do from a response and mitigation perspective once something has already happened. So we've got a couple slides here. We'll be talking through a couple higher level insider threat issues, but mostly, you know, the real meat of this is going to be in a couple case studies that we're going to present here, and that's going to be followed by some tips and tactics that you can try and you can do to raise your program to a higher level of maturity. So insider threat is an issue that's existed for a long time. I think interestingly, in the last couple of years, as more incidents have been publicized, higher profile incidents have been publicized, there's becoming a much greater awareness. So technologies are starting to catch up. And a lot of enterprise security programs are dedicating resources and in a lot of cases building up specific insider threat teams to tackle this, because it very much is a different domain, a different type of expertise and controls apparatus to tackle this type of threat than kind of traditional external threats. Everyone here should already know what an insider is. An insider threat can manifest itself in many different ways. Different companies, different organizations classify these things differently. But in general, you know, most people, when they think of an insider threat, they think of somebody who is malicious, an intentional insider who is seeking to conduct some sort of activity to benefit themselves personally at the expense of the company. There are a lot of other categories of insider threat as well. You know, there's incompetence that sometimes results in damaging type activity. There's the accidental employee. Now that also covers, I think, what we would call an unwitting insider. So a good example of that would be somebody who, say, is working at a technology company on a certain product, has done a lot of work for that product, and is about to move to another job. And that individual might feel that it's within their purview to take the work that they've done with them. So they might, copy data, take a lot of the design files and things like that to their next job. Right now, maybe that person doesn't feel necessarily that he's doing something wrong or that he's acting in an intentionally malicious way, but that could certainly be damaging nonetheless. And that spans the spectrum all the way up to somebody who is perhaps being coached by a sophisticated actor or is a sophisticated actor themselves seeking to steal intellectual property or otherwise conduct some damaging activities. The Carnegie Mellon University, the SEI, the institute over there that runs the insider threat program, programs that they run, and they're constantly at the sort of the forefront of studying insider threats sort of from an academic perspective. And they classify insider threats in 4 primary ways, so or rather the ways that they can manifest. So sabotage, intellectual property theft, fraud, and espionage. And each of these comes with its own set of behavior patterns that you can look for, along with its own set of mitigation strategies. So for example, from the theft of IP perspective, the data shows that within a 90-day window before and after of when an employee learns that they are about to be terminated or that the job is ending in some way, whether it's termination or they're voluntarily resigning, the theft of intellectual property will happen, generally speaking, in that 90-day window. So, the recommendation there would be, of course, to enhance monitoring controls, make sure you have good HR policies in place, exit interviews, things like that, to ensure that there's additional mitigation and monitoring steps set up during that period to prevent the theft of intellectual property. So that's an example. There's a lot of public material available to sort of educate on these aspects. We can get into our first case study now. This is titled "A Corporate Coup," and that actually is a quite accurate description of what it was. So the background on the situation was that there was a company in which the executive team was at conflict with each other. So specifically, the chief operating officer had sort of, over time, developed a base loyal to him and was sort of attempting to seize power from the CEO. The thing that made this specific case study interesting and complex was the fact that a lot of the loyalists to the COO were very, very savvy, technically speaking. So he had fired a lot of the employees that had traditionally been at the company and installed his own IT people, his own security people. And what was going to happen was the board had decided that they wanted to remove the COO, but of course they were concerned about the potential that the COO and his people would be conducting sabotage, steal IP, things like that as soon as they got wind that something might be coming down the pipe. So the action that was taken there was a number of different steps. First, the strategy was devised to physically have the entire group of individuals that would be let go in the same room on the same day at the same time and all notified at once. And now, to prevent the exfiltration of IP or the mass exfiltration of IP or sabotage, we had to have control of the network, and unfortunately, the entire IT department and security team was run by the COO. So we had to essentially surreptitiously gain access to the network. What we did was we, with the help of an employee that was, kind of on the side of the good guys, helped us gain physical access to the office spaces. We were able to install a device that gave us access to the network. Slowly and methodically, we were able to escalate privileges until we had domain admin, and from there, we positioned ourselves to essentially lock out the entire company from all network access at the time of the meeting that would result in the firings of the COO and his loyalists. Okay. Another consideration there was the fact that a lot of data existed on people's personal devices. So we also had to evaluate what type of MDM software people were running, whether or not we can go through that software to either lock out the phones or prevent access to the data, along with, of course, the other endpoint devices like laptop computers and things like that. So the deployment of various tools, locking of email accounts, things like that, setting the stage for that to happen. Now, at the time of the meeting, when the meeting happened, all devices were confiscated from the individuals in question. And immediately, we took forensic images in order to conduct further analysis on what they've done, what they might have taken, and things like that. But the most important part was they did not, once they were notified that they were going to be terminated, they did not have any ongoing access anymore to any sort of company data. The board was also concerned about the possibility that the savvy technical people might have left some sort of backdoor in the network, being able to retain persistent access even in the event that they no longer had traditional access to the company. So we had to run a compromise assessment to ensure that no backdoors were in place for a period of time afterwards. There were a number of employees that were retained whose status were somewhat uncertain. They were not sure whether or not they remained, loyal to the COO or to the company. So what was decided was to deploy monitoring software onto their endpoint devices. Now, this type of software is legal, but the legalities of specific aspects of monitoring vary from state to state. So this happened in California, where two-way audio communications, recording two-way audio communications requires the consent of the employee. And in most employment contracts do cover this, but it is very important, before you deploy any sort of active monitoring against an insider, that you review employment agreements and the legalities associated. But many insider threat monitoring platforms and softwares have the capabilities to essentially be able to track, most things that employee does on a company-owned device, which can be a pretty powerful tool for, both, keeping peace of mind that nothing bad has happened, but also collecting the evidence in the event that something does. So typical insider response engagements generally come in two different ways, right? The first way is going to be that there is something that has happened, an event that has happened. A piece of data has shown up on the dark web. A photograph has shown up in a newspaper, some sort of leak. Something has happened, and the concept is that they're trying to understand what happened, the narrative of who might have done it, why they might have done it, and how they can prevent it from happening again. Now, the second scenario would be when an indicator has appeared that an employee has shown some sort of suspicious activity, and trying to figure out exactly what has happened, what this person is doing, why they might be doing it, and also collecting the chain of evidence in which to take potential employment or legal action at a later date. And both of these types of responses come with a different type of methodology, right? So the first is a little bit more external looking, trying to potentially figure out or walk back how an external piece of information might have gotten to the place it got. So, for example, reviewing who might have had access to suspected data set, to a particular set of data, reviewing internal telemetry, logs, O365 logs, things like that, to see, when and where data might have been transferred out, things like that. From the external perspective, once you have the indicators in place, that investigation can take a different form or a very similar form. It just sort of depends on the controls you have in place and the data that you have available to review. In our experience, most insider threat programs haven't yet reached a very high level of maturity where a lot of data is available for review, but I think you'd be surprised at what data is available to you if you sort of know where to look, and my colleague Paul is going to get into that Just to give you a detection, agents have some sort of logging, some sort of monitoring capability that's either configured to be on by default, or that you can enable that will collect a lot of telemetry that would be useful in an insider threat kind of response exercise. Second case study to go over was an insider threat response that was conducted mostly as an external investigation. So a company with a very high and sensitive store of intellectual property was given a tipper from a vendor that an individual executive was potentially an insider threat of the espionage variety. So the accusation was that this executive was being controlled by a nation state to steal intellectual property, and they weren't really sure, quite what to do about this. They had a very low maturity of their insider threat program. The cybersecurity program in general hadn't reached a high stage of maturity yet, and they were concerned about what to do, right? And this was an instance where, to cut the story short, where the answer was actually good news. So the first thing that is important to do is to validate and verify, the sort of accusations or the indicators that you're receiving that something might be awry. When in doing so, we were able to mostly discredit the data that the vendor had provided. Most of the quote-unquote suspicious indicators that had been provided to the company were benign in nature. I think there is quite a fine line sometimes between an indicator that can be perceived as malicious, but can be something completely innocent. So it's very important, not to sort of blindly trust your security controls, not to blindly trust, what you're seeing, but to verify it with multiple data sources and through an investigation. So in this case, conducting an external investigation, conducting interviews with relevant people, relevant employees, doing a full open source scrub on the individual, and deploying a number of additional investigative techniques, concluded that there was actually a fairly low likelihood that this individual was being controlled by a nation state. So in the end, it was good news. But kind of the moral of the story here is, again, the importance of not only having data, but being able to verify and validate that data through independent investigative efforts. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague Paul to talk more about the maybe the proactive side of insider threat, and along with a couple other ideas on how to leverage data sources that you might already have within your organization to both investigate and also to monitor for these types of threats.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. So part of the services, in addition to what Ryan mentioned in some of the case studies, part of the services that we provide as a company and as an organization is that we provide a red or / purple team type of service. We work with large enterprise customers and have developed a framework that we utilize for attack simulation. We, as an organization, we go in and we work with the customer organization and simulate an insider threat. We have built a physical assessment program, network security assessment programs, and data exfiltration assessment programs surrounding contemporary case studies that we've seen, in addition to those that Ryan have mentioned, and try to simulate and mirror some of the activities that we've observed or that these case studies present. In addition, one of the services or several of the services we provide, we like to look at the network architecture and technology review. As Ryan mentioned, there's several data sources that have been utilized historically for incident response and security monitoring that also come into play in the insider threat realm. In addition, there's identity and access management systems, different log sources that we typically utilize for these types of investigations, in addition to the active employee monitoring solutions that were described previously. Another critical component of the assessments that we provide is that we undertake to perform a critical asset review with our clients and customer organizations to help them to identify kind of the crown jewels of the organization and what it is that a potential insider would be targeting inside the organization, and the potential methodologies and means that might be leveraged to go after these assets, whether they're health information, PII, intellectual property, dependent upon the customer and the organization. Obviously, there's either a variety of these threats, a composition of these threats, or maybe a single line of threat. But we try to help the customer organization to identify what the threats are and where kind of the crown jewels of the organization are, and then walk backwards and try to identify the mitigating controls that may be in place or that may be gaps, and help the organization from a technical review identify those issues. In addition to that, we support existing insider threat program development and review. As Ryan mentioned rightfully, much of the challenge with the initial phases of insider threat program development largely sets with legal issues and human resource issues, to be honest. And sometimes the technical components are actually the easiest part. Integrating logging and assessment on the technical side is often less challenging at times than getting through the legal hurdles and as Ryan mentioned, the state-by-state nuances that are inherent with that. So, some of the log sources that we have, are specifically looking at include DNS logs, as I mentioned, identity and access management systems, Active Directory logging, database logs, taking historically what has been the network security monitoring kind of model and applying it to seeking out the human threat and the human terrain is a focus of our efforts. I'll turn the time over back to you, Ryan.
Great, thanks, Paul. I think now I think we might be at a good point to open it up for questions from the audience. Like I mentioned, we covered the insider threat material at a general and fairly broad, high-level perspective, but hoping to have this be interactive. So happy to answer any questions from the audience.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan, and thank you, Paul. Thanks so much for that information. There have been some questions come in, and I'm going to just give me a second here to organize them a bit. Maybe we start with this one that came in a little bit earlier. What are the common signs that I might see to identify that I have an insider threat, and what can I do to counter them?
Sure, good question. I'll take a first stab at that, Paul, and then I'll turn it over to you for any additional insights. But again, there's a lot publicized out there regarding the typical indicators of insider activity based upon the different categories of insiders. So, if memory serves, for example, an insider that's likely to commit some sort of act of sabotage will generally speaking, have demonstrated some signs that might be visible to, say, an HR department, things like disinterest in work, showing up late, being disheveled in appearance, having other employees, flag kind of unusual or odd behavior, and all of those indicators all point to an HR department or an insider threat team to take additional actions to maybe monitor, conduct an employee interview, and otherwise try to get a handle of the situation before the actual activity manifests itself. But again, these types of indicators are published by CMU. Encourage you to review their materials for those types of things. Now, there's a lot of insider threat technologies out there as well. So not just EDR, but if you're talking about different kind of insider threat specific type software out there that can give you an even greater depth of indicator. And I'll kind of let Paul talk to that.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, definitely. In conjunction with, as I mentioned, the historical security controls. I mean, an emerging area that is definitely has application inside the insider threat realm is the behavior analytics systems. In addition to that, we typically will look at physical access systems and auditing logs, as well as potentially if there's a closed circuit TV or image monitoring in the facility or in the organization to try to understand, what is normal, baseline, what is normal for employee behavior, and look for anomalies. So much of what we do in this space is anomaly detection. We're looking for, as Ryan mentioned, odd work hours, accesses outside of expected work windows and work times. A large component of a successful program is the human interaction. Typically, we can conduct interviews with direct line managers or peers if, in fact, there is suspicion of an individual being involved with an insider threat, or if there's disgruntledness being observed. That human factor, that human terrain often leads us to the technical repositories and things that we would be looking for on the technical side. Definitely Active Directory monitoring and auditing of access to databases and file shares and servers. I mean, all of these kind of come into play as a composite view of the individual. In addition, understanding from an HR perspective, maybe understanding some of the ideological concerns that may be present with an individual or group of individuals, some of their allegiances, there's a lot of different factors that come into play in these types of assessments, both in the technical realm as well as in the human side.
Well, thanks for that, Ryan and Paul. There was a question that came up about HR earlier on before you just started giving that response. Maybe I'll modify it slightly. How closely do you see HR function in an organization working with the threat analyst team on this, and how is that typically managed from your experience in working with your clients, the collaboration of HR and threat analysts?
Paul, I defer to you on that one.
Sure. I mean, I think it is heavily dependent upon the maturity of the program, but definitely HR is a core stakeholder in the development of any insider threat program itself. Being able to have access to those, employee history, some of the HR specific data points, and some of the controls actually that are in place at different organizations based on HR policies. Definitely, the HR component I think is fundamental and critical. HR and legal are definitely critical to the success of any program, and having that constant interaction and viewing them as a core stakeholder in the process, I think empowers them as well as it empowers the analyst to have that that interaction directly and to be able to answer questions or concerns that come up kind of on the fly as a cohesive team trying to attack the problem.
Okay, here's another question that came in. How is the evolution of a workforce into a remote work model, working from home, et cetera, working anywhere someone happens to be, how does that affect the ability to effectively counter insider threats?
That's a really great question, and yeah, it certainly adds to the complexity and the challenge of doing so, right? Because now, with it adds in the same level of control of your network environment as you were previously. Paul, we recently ran a red team kind of looking at this exact issue. What a remote employee might be able to do utilizing some baseline access from their laptop. Maybe you can go over some lessons learned from that project and what some of the audience might be able to do to.
Yes, definitely. That was actually a recent project that I was involved with for a large organization. Definitely challenges are presented with the remote workforce in addition to BYOD as that's becoming more and more prevalent. Those definitely pose challenges to any data protection program, any data security program in and of itself. Mobile device management platforms, data loss protection platforms assist definitely in the mitigation of those types of threats, as well as EDR monitoring and management. But at the end of the day, a determined insider who has access to critical and sensitive data inside an organization in a remote and deployed workforce like that is definitely one of the biggest challenges from an investigative and analytical perspective. And it does require vigilance across the spectrum. Definitely document tagging and classification systems are critical to the DLP monitoring and to be able to track and monitor document movement throughout the organization and external to the organization. All of those types of issues come into play, and as Ryan, as you mentioned, they're accentuated or even made more challenging with the remote workforce. So definitely systems auditing, data loss prevention on the endpoint. I mean, all these layers of the detection framework or monitoring detection framework have to come into play, and we've found great success in some of the kind of back to basics of monitoring and auditing. But in addition to that, it does require a kind of full spectrum, full court press for sure.
Okay, another question came in, and I'll tie it to something earlier in your potentially finding evidence of data on the dark web. Maybe I'll extend this question that someone asked about data crossing international boundaries. This is what the question was. What recourse does a company have if intellectual property and data crosses a physical, geographical, national boundary, move overseas? How can you typically remediate that?
Yeah, unfortunately, the answer there is pretty case by case. I think there have been a lot of instances where a country that has, well, let me take a step back. If that intellectual property loss or that data that was taken rises to the level in which federal law enforcement authorities would get involved, there are certain countries where relationships enable an action to be taken. Server takedowns and things like that could assist in this type of thing. Generally speaking, though, I think once data has crossed international boundaries, a victim, in this case, the company generally finds it fairly difficult to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak. But case by case dependent, there are and might be things that could be done. Again, there can rise kind of across the spectrum, like depending on how creative and how forward-leaning you might want to get. There are opportunities to say, poison the data. There are opportunities to engage with the threat actors potentially to get that data at least wiped off the easily accessible places where it might have been. Hate to use that answer that it depends, but in this case, it kind of does.
That makes sense. Obviously, it is pretty challenging and case by case specific. A couple of questions have come in about identifying insider threats. That seems to be an area that people are interested in, and maybe coming back to that, one of the questions was the indicators of insider threat displayed overtly, or in general, do you see it more through covert action? I think that's what the question's about, the difference between overt action and covert action on the part of the insiders or the potential insiders.
Sure, great question. I think the answer is both. Right now, and the kind of the proliferation of knowledge on operational security, so OPSEC, being able to conduct digital activity anonymously, is growing. So that's going to make it continuously more challenging in the future as more people sort of understand how to hide their tracks and how to do things covertly. So that's going to make it more challenging. But right now, still, I think the average baseline OPSEC understanding of an individual insider threat generally means that they'll leave some sort of traces, right? So, again, this sort of depends on the types of controls that you have in place, but the indicators that you might have a candidate to worry about and enhance monitoring on are again fairly well documented, and I think becoming educated on what those indicators are important. Now, if you're talking about like the very sophisticated insider threats, so maybe those of the espionage variety, those being controlled or otherwise being coached by, say, a nation state, that becomes much more difficult. We've encountered a couple vendors out there that are interestingly trying to tackle this problem, kind of niche vendors. One way they're doing it is through keywords. So, understanding the types of keywords that you might be able to, say, load into to your SIM instance to be on the lookout for, and that could, once a couple of those keywords pop up on the activity of an individual, that might trigger an additional level of monitoring or additional suspicion on that individual. So, the sophisticated actors, that is a very difficult topic to tackle, but there are efforts being taken. Paul, would you have anything to add to that?
I would definitely agree with everything you mentioned, as well as I think it depends on the type of threat actor. I think a disgruntled employee who is upset with company policies or his manager, I think they would be much more overt, much more, at least initially, I think there would be overt indicators that this individual may be a threat to the organization or to others. And as you mentioned, I do agree that as the sophistication of the threat increases, I think it becomes harder and harder to detect, and definitely in the nation-state agent slash corporate espionage realm, I would expect actors who engage in those types of activities to be much more discreet and much more covert about their activities. But the one may turn into the other. There are a plethora of case studies where individuals initially are disgruntled, they initially have a disagreement with co-workers, individuals within the workplace, and it gradually escalates into them maybe reaching out based on ideological allegiances or a desire for personal gain. They may quickly shift towards a more discreet and more covert type of level of activity, let's say. So the one may morph and meld into the other. So I mean that's why we mentioned the concept of full spectrum monitoring, definitely in the human terrain as well as on the technical side, because the one may feed the other and it may be iterative, and hopefully we can identify and stem and work with an individual before they advance to these different stages in kind of this threat model. But I do believe that initially, outside of maybe an embedded agent who is placed in an organization for a specific purpose, outside of those narrow cases, I think there would be an evolution as someone approaches these types of, as the threat increases, let's say.
Hey, Paul, I think it might be useful at this point, maybe to, if you wouldn't mind recapping, all the data sources that a company would sort of use to monitor, maybe at different levels of maturity. I think that might be a useful thing to review.
In front of me that I can kind of cull from. I guess I can just kind of read top down if there's any questions or any additions or anything for the group. Please feel free to post a question to the channel, I guess. I guess from a top-down perspective, we look at local machine event logs, local file system and registry content for any types of malicious software or implants that may have been introduced into the environment to provide persistent access to the threat actor. Definitely, as I mentioned a bit ago, the identity and access management data, LDAP, Active Directory types of data logs and auditing statistics. We did mention the behavioral analytics system data. Platform that ingests and incorporates many of the data types that historically have been part of kind of the SIM realm, but are being applied specifically for the insider threat and understanding employee and technical systems behavior. DLP systems data, again, as mentioned during the question regarding the remote workforce, DLP is becoming a more and more critical component to the overall overarching technical side of insider threat detection and mitigation. DHCP logs identifying when systems are being turned on and off and accessing the network, looking for commonality and patterns of life and all of that. Again, DNS logs for website access. What we've seen on occasion is that an access agent or someone who's involved with an external party in targeting an organization may introduce implants or malicious software into an organization, which then beacon back to a command and control system and allow persistent access for the third-party actor inside the organization. Again, looking for indicators of compromise similar to incident response type of model. Host, again, file server and database access logs and audit logs, email records, who are the individuals of interest talking to, who are they emailing inside the organization and outside the organization, if possible content analysis of those emails, attachments, what types of data are being sent in and out of the organization. I think, Ryan, you mentioned the cloud access providers, O365, I mean, all these different logging components and auditing components. In conjunction with that, proxy servers, web access logs, where are these individuals going, what sites are they viewing, are they spending time on Pastebin or different paste sites? Do we see that type of traffic occurring? Kind of the holistic look at that. And then shifting away from the network security model, we also want to look at things such as printer logs. I mean, in this day and age, we kind of forget that printed media and maybe removable media, when allowed inside the organization, are huge vectors for people walking content out still in our day. I mean, everyone is typically focused on the network-based digital transfer of intellectual property and personal identifiable information, but we still see a large threat vector where an individual will has access to printers and can print content and walk it out maybe inside of a folder and exfiltrate data that way. So we look at that as well. So, I mean, these are some of the investigative sources I think I mentioned earlier. CCTV video, physical access systems. Do we see odd patterns of individuals swiping in and out of secure facilities or secure data centers or locations? Do we see odd hours of access into offices or vaults that they don't necessarily have access to, or are they alone? I mean, all these types of systems all feed into kind of the analytical picture.
Thanks for that, Paul. That's quite an extensive list and a lot for a company to get control of, I imagine. And there's a couple. This question's come up a couple of times, and maybe it's a good way to start to wrap things up. So, after all of that, what's the first thing you would advise a company to do if they suspect they have a developing or potential insider threat in the form of a disgruntled insider? Where do they start?
This is Paul. I mean, honestly, outside of an individual who is involved in either corporate espionage or nation-state espionage, at the end of the day, my personal feeling on that is that we are dealing with a human. And if we can interdict that human through either employee outreach programs, personal counseling, if there's some way to get out in front of the threat so it doesn't become and evolve into the condition where this individual is taking action against the organization, I think that's the best place to identify and mitigate it if we can. And that can come through personal interaction, either through direct line management, HR. I mean, some type of way to identify and maybe walk the person away from the edge, right? I mean, at the end of the day, employee outreach programs trying to address the concerns or the conditions that are creating this insider threat, I think, are very powerful. Obviously, once a individual is determined to cause harm to the organization, that the paradigm shifts. But if we can interdict it at a human level, I think that's very powerful. In addition to that, at the end of the day, this person who may have once posed a threat to the organization, once they feel that their concerns are heard and addressed, they may become your best advocate and your biggest advocate. So you can quickly turn somebody from your potentially your biggest threat to your best friend.
Okay. Well, I think that we should begin to wrap up. I don't know, Ryan, do you have anything to add to what Paul described about first things to do and to manage the human aspect of the threat?
I don't. I think that was a very comprehensive answer.
Excellent. I agree. Well, I think that we should begin to wrap up in the interest of time. We have contact information for how you and the audience can reach the Nisos team if you have any further questions about the subject. Please do reach out, and I'm sure that Ryan and Paul or the rest of the team will be able to help you get the answers that you need. As well, for those of you in the audience, I'd like to ask a favor of you. As you shut down the Bright Talk dashboard today, when we're done here in a minute, you will be presented with an opportunity to provide feedback. In addition to just telling us how well you think we did, you'll have an opportunity to ask more questions, and we'll make sure that Ryan and Paul and the Nisos team get those questions and they can continue that conversation with you. So thank you both. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Paul, for a great presentation and really interesting and important content. And thanks to all of you who joined us today, and we are going to wish you a great day and hope that we see you again here on the Tech and Cyber Trends channel sometime in the near future. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.